a thunderclap in global finance. At a quiet European port, a shipment of gold worth $300 million US, destined for Burkina Faso, was frozen without warning. No court order, no customs issue, just a phone call, and behind it the unmistakable voice of a former U.S. president. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its price. In that one sentence, centuries of exploitation echoed into the present. But this time, something feels different. Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest nations, had planned to use that gold for schools, hospitals, and food security. Instead, it was held hostage, not by pirates but by policy. For the people in Ouagadougou, the capital, this wasn't just a news headline. It was a punch to the gut. A mother waiting for medicine at a rural clinic, a teacher whose school lacks chalk, a miner working 12 hours underground. Suddenly their future was held in foreign hands. So the question is, can a nation be sovereign if its wealth can be stopped mid-ocean? Subscribe now, because in this video, we'll follow the gold, the politics, and the rising defiance of a continent that has had enough. This isn't just a blocked shipment. It's the beginning of a resistance. And at the heart of it is one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The world may have frozen the gold, but he's about to melt the silence. It began as a routine financial transaction. $300 million worth of gold mined from the soil of Burkina Faso, loaded onto ships, bound for refining and revenue. But somewhere between the Sahel and a European port, the gold vanished. Not physically, but politically. The cargo was frozen, sealed under instructions from financial regulators. And behind those instructions stood the invisible hands of Washington. No court challenge, no pending lawsuit. Just a whisper in the right corridor, and a sovereign nation's wealth was put on hold. Officially, it was about compliance with IMF standards. Unofficially, it was a message. Play by our rules, or pay the price. For Burkina Faso, that gold was more than metal. It was a promise. Funding for new rural hospitals, updated infrastructure, school programs in districts where children still study under trees. The gold was already budgeted, earmarked, and celebrated. Its sudden seizure sent shockwaves through every ministry in Ouagadougou. And then came the press leak. The order came from Washington, with IMF consultation, citing Burkina's alignment with BRICS nations as a destabilizing financial signal. The move stunned the capital. But out in the countryside, the effects were immediate. In the village of Kupela, 53-year-old Mariam Doumbia sat outside a clinic with her 6-year-old son. The boy suffers from sickle cell anemia. Medication had run out. The doctor apologized. Funds for the next shipment had been frozen. "They say it's politics," Mariam whispered, "but it feels like punishment." For Mariam, the gold wasn't a geopolitical issue. It was hope, measured in milligrams of medicine. For the miner who pulled those bars from underground, it was dignity. For the teacher waiting on school supplies, it was progress. And yet, all of it had been stopped by voices thousands of miles away. IMF rules demand repayment in U.S. dollars, with interest rates climbing to 7 to 9%, while Western nations borrow at 2% or less. For a country like Burkina Faso, whose GDP per capita barely exceeds $900, the math is cruel. Loans that once looked like partnerships now resemble shackles. And when Traoré's government signaled a pivot toward India and BRICS-aligned trade, the response from the West wasn't dialogue. It was financial warfare. The narrative painted by international media was clean and clinical. Risky pivot. Currency instability. MF concern. But on the ground, in dusty markets and crowded classrooms, the message felt simpler. Africa, stay in line. Within the government itself, the atmosphere turned from confusion to urgency. Budget officers scrambled to revise spending schedules. Contracts with foreign construction firms were suspended. A long-awaited irrigation project in the north, designed to transform thousands of hectares into fertile farmland, was put on indefinite hold. Teachers who had just signed new contracts were told to wait, and in the town of Fada Ngurma, construction halted on a new maternity clinic. Half-built walls now standing as painful reminders of what might have been. Each delay cut deeper than policy. It undermined confidence. It said in quiet but unmistakable terms that no matter how hard a nation worked, its progress could be stalled by foreign approval. In another corner of the country, in Bobo Dioulasso, a 28-year-old university graduate named Issouf sat in a cafe scrolling through the news. He had studied economics, dreaming of launching a small tech startup focused on financial literacy for rural youth. He had just secured a small government grant, funded in part by expected gold revenue. Now that grant was gone. "I thought I was building the future," he said, "but it seems the future is still not ours to claim." And across Burkina Faso, that sentiment echoed, loud, bitter, unshakable. The gold was meant to lift them. Instead, it became a symbol of how quickly dreams can be confiscated. For Captain Traoré and millions like Issouf and Mariam, this was more than a blockade. It was a line drawn in the sand. A reminder that even in 2025, the sovereignty of a nation can still be negotiated over lunch in a foreign capital. But what exactly triggered this global standoff? What caused a simple shipment to become a symbol of defiance? That moment is what we explore next. Before a packed room of ministers, generals, and journalists, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not reach for compromise. He reached for history. The seizure of Burkina Faso's gold was not, in his words, an economic issue. It was a declaration of control. And with piercing clarity, he made his position known. "This is not debt," he said, "this is control." Those 5 words sliced through the diplomatic haze and landed with thunderous weight. He wasn't speaking to bureaucrats. He was speaking to the people. The farmer whose wheat doesn't reach the market because of bad roads, the student whose dreams are stalled by unpaid scholarships, the nurse whose clinic lacks power. For years, Africa had been told to behave, to conform, to borrow. Now, Burkina Faso was telling the world, enough. His statement ignited a fire across the country. Within hours, protests erupted in Ouagadougou. Not riots of desperation, but declarations of dignity. Thousands surged into the city square. Old veterans carried national flags. University students painted slogans on cardboard and bedsheets. Entire families marched, some with infants strapped to their backs, others with golden-painted stones held high, symbols of the wealth beneath their soil. The chants echoed from block to block. "Our gold is not collateral. Our future is not for sale." Across villages and towns, that same message took root. In Dori, miners returned from the shafts not to rest but to organize a march. In Banfora, small shop owners closed early to join crowds outside the local governor's office. Farmers from the countryside rode donkeys and motorbikes into cities, carrying banners scrawled with homemade paint. "Bread is earned, not borrowed." In Bobo Dioulasso, a father stood with his 2 teenage sons. He held a placard that read, "We mine the gold." They hold the key. Who really owns this land? The protest was not just massive, it was deeply human, and it was unified. Western media reacted swiftly. Headlines in Paris, London, and New York described the events as instability, populism, and nationalist overreach. Editorials warned of rising autocracy and economic sabotage. Experts were rolled out to predict doom, capital flight, credit downgrades, isolation. But the images from the ground told another story. Photographs showed children waving miniature flags, women leading chants, and elderly men standing guard at intersections. People brought food to share. Volunteers collected trash to keep streets clean. Artists painted murals overnight. Gold bars transforming into schools, clinics, and water towers. The atmosphere felt less like chaos and more like clarity, a people reclaiming their voice. International observers were stunned. In a continent often portrayed as fragmented, Burkina Faso was displaying rare cohesion, not because of propaganda or coercion, but because the people believed their leader had spoken a truth long buried. In a televised interview, a young teacher named Awa Savadogo said, "For once, we are not just reacting. We are building something. They may freeze our gold, but they cannot freeze our will." Her words went viral. Outside the continent, reactions were split. Some called Traoré reckless. Others called him visionary. But inside Burkina Faso, the effect was unmistakable. The gold might have been seized, but a new momentum had been released, one that no customs order could contain. Even skeptics began to reconsider. Traoré wasn't simply refusing IMF terms. He was reshaping the national psychology from one of passive acceptance to active defiance. And in doing so, he gave the people something rare, a reason to believe that sovereignty was not just an idea, but a responsibility worth defending. And yet, as the global spotlight intensified, so too did the risks. In the editorial halls of Washington, London, and Brussels, policymakers began whispering of new measures, coordinated sanctions, asset freezes, even pressure on neighboring states to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically. Financial institutions warned of potential downgrades and market volatility. But to many in the streets, those words were code for economic retaliation against a nation that dared to speak for itself. Back in Ouagadougou, 24-year-old journalist David Ouedraogo documented it all with his smartphone. From rooftop views, he captured sweeping drone shots of peaceful crowds and hand-painted banners fluttering like sails of a ship changing direction. One video showed a grandmother holding up a loaf of bread and shouting into the camera, "Let them take their loans. We will keep our dignity." The clip garnered over 2 million views in 48 hours. In schools, classrooms paused to discuss what was happening. In churches and mosques, prayers were offered not just for peace, but for strength. The movement had surpassed politics. It had become a moral stand. The world could try to explain it away, but Burkina Faso had already made its choice. The real question was, would the world respect that choice or punish it? Was this the spark of change or the beginning of backlash? The protests in Burkina Faso were not just a display of national pride. They revealed a civil landscape already on the edge. As the streets of Ouagadougou filled with chants and painted banners, quieter battles unfolded in clinics, schools, and homes across the country. The freezing of $300 million worth of gold didn't just shake the headlines. It choked the arteries of daily life. In the northern provinces, rural clinics began rationing medicine. Doctors had warned for weeks that supplies were running low, and now, with international transactions halted, shipments of antibiotics, vaccines, and prenatal vitamins were indefinitely delayed. At a regional health center in Kaya, a nurse named Thomas Konate faced 30 expectant mothers with only a handful of sterile gloves and no working ultrasound machine. "It's not just gold that's frozen," he said. "It's our ability to save lives." Across the education sector, the consequences struck with equal cruelty. Teachers in newly opened schools were told their salaries would be delayed. Construction on over a dozen rural classrooms was paused. In the city of Gawa, students arrived to find their school gate chained shut. The director, in tears, explained that fuel subsidies for buses had been cut. Without gold revenue, the transportation contract had collapsed overnight. For families already living under $2 a day, these disruptions were more than inconvenience. They were survival. Mothers began pulling children from school, not out of protest, but to help in the fields and markets. In the region of Bulsa, a grandmother named Adama, raising 4 grandchildren alone, said quietly, "I sent them to school to break the cycle. Now they're back digging yam with their hands." The crisis also accelerated internal migration. As state services weakened, thousands left rural villages to seek aid in urban centers. Camps of displaced citizens sprang up near city peripheries. Improvised tents, long lines for food, and volunteer medical units stretched thin. Local NGOs described the moment not as economic fallout, but as a creeping humanitarian emergency. Politically, the atmosphere was just as tense. In the National Assembly, opposition lawmakers demanded an emergency session. While some denounced foreign interference, others questioned whether Traoré had overplayed his hand. Debates turned fiery. Would continued defiance isolate Burkina Faso beyond repair? Or was this the painful step required for true independence? Captain Traoré, for his part, remained unwavering. He addressed the nation in a televised speech, stating, "When a man stands up, he feels the wind. But if he kneels, he never moves." His words were met with applause, but also with unease. Within the military, lines were being drawn. Younger officers, inspired by Traoré's bold stance, pledged loyalty. But senior commanders, many with past training in Western academies, urged caution. Rumors circulated of quiet pressure campaigns, from outside embassies and from inside political factions, warning of regional instability and the potential for intervention. And yet the people held firm. In churches, pastors replaced sermons with discussions on justice. In mosques, imams prayed not only for peace but for patience. Artists, musicians, and poets poured into the streets, their work echoing through radios and social media. Gold is ours. Dignity is ours. Let no price undo what we have claimed. But as resilience grew at home, so did fears abroad. Western analysts watched closely. The disruption of IMF repayment schedules triggered red alerts in bond markets. The World Bank released a cautious memo forecasting a 5% GDP contraction in Burkina Faso if the crisis persisted. Credit rating agencies floated the threat of a downgrade, another lever of pressure that could restrict access to development loans. And for ordinary citizens, these abstract warnings had concrete effects. Prices of imported goods soared. Diesel doubled in price in some towns. Pharmacies ran out of insulin. Internet speeds slowed as telecom providers lost access to international payment systems. Yet the determination remained. In an impromptu town hall in Tenkodogo, a young woman named Clarice, recently laid off from a textile factory, stood up and asked, "How many times will we sell our future to buy someone else's approval?" The room erupted in applause. Traoré's administration began considering emergency domestic measures, bartering agreements with BRICS nations, state-backed ration cards, local production incentives. Small-scale farmers were offered government contracts to produce staples. Street vendors were invited to join cooperative unions to stabilize food access. It wasn't smooth, but it was sovereign. Still, the pressure was mounting. Diplomats from neighboring nations quietly expressed concern. ECOWAS leaders debated whether to support Burkina Faso's bold course or encourage moderation. The African Union remained officially silent, though several member states offered quiet words of solidarity. What became clear was this: the consequences of resistance were no longer theoretical. They were daily, measurable, and growing. Yet so too was the national will. And looming over it all was the question that every household now whispered at dinner. Every market trader debated between transactions, and every journalist posed at the close of their columns. But how would the United States respond? Would it double down or step back and listen? The streets of Burkina Faso may have roared with defiance, but it was in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing where the deeper tremors were felt. To the United States and its allies, the gold freeze was never just about bullion. It was about precedent. A small West African nation had drawn a line against the international financial order, and the world was watching. In Washington, the response was swift and layered. Publicly, officials from the State Department issued carefully worded statements about regional stability, respect for multilateral agreements, and concerns over fiscal governance. But behind closed doors, a more urgent strategy unfolded. The Treasury Department convened emergency consultations with the IMF and key European financial regulators. The goal was clear: maintain pressure, keep the gold frozen, signal to others, especially in Africa, that deviation from IMF protocols would carry consequences. Within the IMF itself, high-level executives circulated memos emphasizing Burkina Faso's credit risk and institutional volatility. Interest rates on future loans to the region quietly climbed. Disbursements were delayed. Proposals for debt restructuring were tabled. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Do not follow Traoré's path. Meanwhile, U.S.-aligned media outlets began shaping the narrative. Major newspapers ran op-eds questioning Traoré's legitimacy. Headlines warned of youthful radicalism, reckless populism, and economic brinkmanship. News segments highlighted images of empty grocery shelves, not peaceful protests. The framing was deliberate. Burkina Faso was not resisting. It was destabilizing. And yet, the world was no longer a one-sided echo chamber. In Moscow, the gold crisis was met with interest. Russian state media portrayed Traoré as a hero of anti-colonial resistance. In Beijing, editorial pages spoke of sovereign right to development and praised Burkina Faso's exploration of alternative currency systems. China's central bank discreetly offered to open yuan-denominated trade channels for Sahelian gold exports. A quiet deal with a Chinese refinery began to take shape. India went further. A spokesperson from its Ministry of External Affairs declared, "Africa must be free to manage its resources without conditionality." Indian financial institutions, backed by state assurances, opened lines of credit to Burkina Faso, bypassing dollar-based intermediaries entirely. Gold for infrastructure barter agreements were proposed, modeled after similar deals India had struck with Venezuela and Iran. The BRICS bloc, already exploring alternatives to dollar-dominated trade, seized the moment. A draft resolution circulated among member states calling for the creation of an emergency reserve access mechanism to support member nations facing politically motivated financial blockades. For the first time, the idea of a coordinated counterweight to the IMF had moved from theory to planning. Back in Europe, the mood was divided. While France and Belgium pushed for continued financial isolation, smaller EU economies expressed concern. Was this freeze truly about financial responsibility? Or a new form of soft coercion? In Berlin, a leaked memo from the Ministry of Finance questioned the legality of freezing sovereign reserves without clear international consensus. Quiet diplomatic rifts began to appear. In Africa, the effects of global polarization were immediate. Civil society groups in Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even South Africa issued statements of solidarity with Burkina Faso. Protesters held signs that read, "Our gold, our rules." University students from Kenya to Senegal launched webinars analyzing the gold crisis as a case study in neocolonial resistance. Across the Sahel, Traoré's defiance became not just news, but curriculum. At the same time, the U.S. intelligence community raised alarms. Internal reports warned that if Burkina Faso succeeded in bypassing IMF controls, it could trigger a wave of copycat strategies, particularly in resource-rich, debt-burdened nations. The phrase monetary rebellion began to circulate in policy briefings. One memo to the National Security Council asked bluntly, "Is the dollar's dominance facing a new front?" The concern wasn't ideological, it was structural. If African nations could reprice their resources in other currencies, if gold could flow outside of SWIFT channels, if sovereign reserves could be pooled regionally and defended militarily, then the entire scaffolding of global debt enforcement might tilt. The Pentagon even chimed in. Analysts warned that instability in the Sahel could invite new security partnerships between African states and U.S. rivals, Russian military trainers, Chinese cyber units, Iranian logistics. The gold was no longer just a symbol of economic resistance. It had become a node in a broader strategic realignment. And so a paradox emerged. Every new sanction, every public condemnation, every blocked transaction only reinforced Traoré's narrative that Burkina Faso was standing alone because it dared to stand at all. What Western diplomats labeled economic consequences, the streets of Africa increasingly saw as confirmation. In Washington, one senior diplomat reportedly asked during a closed-door meeting, "What if we've created the very resistance we wanted to avoid?" That question now looms over more than just one country. Could this be the spark of a global realignment? Or merely a flash of resistance soon buried by retaliation? The decision to store Africa's gold on African soil was more than symbolic. It was strategic. In the wake of the international freeze on Burkina Faso's $300 million in gold, leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger convened in an emergency summit. There, behind closed doors and guarded compounds, they made a bold proposal to build a continent-owned, militarily protected gold reserve. The location would remain undisclosed, deep within the border triangle of the three nations. Its construction would be overseen not by foreign contractors but by joint Sahelian forces. The vault would be buried beneath reinforced concrete, armored steel, and round-the-clock surveillance. And standing at the gates would not be private security but soldiers, trained, armed, and committed to a singular purpose: defend the wealth of Africa from foreign control. For years, African armies had been deployed to guard borders drawn in colonial ink or fight insurgencies inflamed by foreign intervention. Now, for the first time in living memory, they were mobilizing to protect economic sovereignty. Captain Traoré addressed his generals with blunt clarity. "You're no longer just defenders of territory," he said. "You are guardians of legacy." His words struck deep. These were not mercenaries for hire. They were citizens in uniform defending something that generations before them had never touched: control over their own resources. The logistical challenges were immense, but so too was the public support. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, citizens rallied to contribute. Farmers donated sacks of millet to feed soldiers at the construction site. Miners volunteered to dig the foundations. School teachers led fundraisers in classrooms encouraging students to bring even 1 franc. In one village near Koro, elders voted to offer a patch of land, ancestral and sacred, as part of the vault's buffer zone. "Let our soil protect our gold," the chief declared. In Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight. One depicted a soldier holding a bar of gold in one hand and a baby in the other. Another showed vault doors flanked by the 3 national flags, bound together with iron chains not of captivity, but of unity. Children painted slogans on schoolyard walls. "Guard the gold. Guard the future." Western observers dismissed the project as populist theater. But intelligence reports told a different story. The Sahel Vault was no longer theory. It was a fast-developing asset, and it was galvanizing not just defense strategies, but political will. Mali deployed engineering units with Soviet-era equipment to begin tunneling. Niger provided perimeter security and communications networks. Burkina Faso contributed special forces trained in counterintelligence to guard against sabotage. Each nation rotated units weekly, ensuring no single government had unilateral control. But as construction advanced, so did the threats. Reports surfaced of unknown drones flying near the planned perimeter. Satellite imagery revealed suspicious satellite passovers from Western-aligned intelligence agencies. In neighboring states, foreign-backed militias increased activity near border regions. Traoré's administration warned of external attempts to destabilize what cannot be stopped directly. In response, AES activated a Joint Rapid Response Force, an unprecedented move. For the first time, troops from 3 Sahel nations trained together, not under NATO or ECOWAS, but under their own unified command. Their mission was clear: protect the reserve, repel sabotage, and hold the line, both literal and symbolic. Domestically, the Gold Vault became a point of civic pride. In town halls and market squares, citizens debated defense strategies, watched updates on portable radios, and shared rations with off-duty guards. Young people, once disillusioned by politics, now enlisted in national service programs. Not for war, but for protection. One 19-year-old recruit from Bamako said, "I am not just fighting for my country. I'm fighting for a future where we decide what our country becomes." But defending the gold was only part of the strategy. AES leaders also launched a campaign to protect digital infrastructure and communication lines. Cybersecurity units were formed to guard against financial hacking and disinformation. Data centers were hardened. Local tech students were recruited to build encryption systems. Traoré called it the firewall for our future. Outside the region, concern turned to alarm. Western financial institutions feared that a successful African vault would set a precedent. What if more nations pulled their reserves from foreign banks? What if they linked gold to new regional currencies, immune to dollar fluctuations? What if Africa, long divided, united around a single reserve, a single shield? The implications were not lost on military planners in foreign capitals. White papers warned of strategic recalibrations and the loss of extractive leverage. The U.S. Department of Defense flagged the Sahel Reserve as a potential hard power node with soft power reverberations. Translation: the vault could inspire a movement far beyond gold. Back in the Sahel, though, inspiration was already taking root. A new anthem emerged, composed by Burkinabe musicians, played on radios across the region. Its chorus echoed, "Our gold, our ground, our guard." In schools, students recited oaths of defense. In mosques and churches, sermons blessed the soldiers. In every village, every market, every heart, the vault was no longer just metal. It was meaning. But with meaning came danger. Could the shield hold? Would outside forces respect its boundaries? Or would they test them? First with pressure, then with provocation. Will Africa's shield be strong enough? Or will the storm break through the walls we built? The story began with a single shipment of gold. $300 million mined from the soil of Burkina Faso, frozen by command whispered across oceans. What followed was not just a diplomatic dispute, it was an awakening, a test of sovereignty, a challenge to a system older than most nations. And now the world stands at a precipice. Captain Traoré's words still ring. Gold is not collateral. Gold is freedom. And freedom is never begged. It is built. In that statement, he drew a line not just in sand, but in stone. A challenge not just to financial coercion, but to the very architecture of post-colonial dependency. The consequences have been severe. Clinics without medicine, schools without salaries, families without food security. Economic hardship that cuts through every layer of daily life. But through it all, the people stood firm, not because they welcomed the pain, but because they finally understood the price of compromise. For decades, Africa was told it had no choice, that obedience to foreign terms was the only path to progress, that debt was destiny, and that sovereignty was a slogan, not a strategy. But what if that's no longer true? The alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, now dares to imagine an alternative. A vault buried not under Paris or London, but beneath their own feet. Soldiers guarding not someone else's borders, but their own birthright. Citizens contributing not to a foreign treasury, but to a national legacy. It's not perfect. It's not easy, but it is, undeniably, theirs. Still, the warning signs are everywhere. Sanctions tighten. Media campaigns escalate. Covert interference creeps in. The machinery of global finance has not fallen silent. It has simply shifted tactics. From overt control to whispered manipulation. From legal pressure to reputational sabotage. Western institutions fear the ripple effects. What if more nations follow? What if Africa becomes not a source of profit, but a center of power? This is the crossroads. Africa can either retreat, return to the quiet subjugation of conditional aid, resource extraction, and perpetual repayment. Or it can advance, slowly, painfully, but intentionally, toward a future shaped on its own terms. The vault is only the beginning. The real battle is for belief. Do Africans believe that they are the rightful stewards of their wealth? Do they trust each other enough to build something lasting? Do they have the courage to endure what that vision demands? And what of the world? Will the United States double down on control, or will it step back and listen? Will the IMF remain a tool of leverage, or reform to reflect the dignity of all members? Will Europe continue to guard its colonial privileges in financial disguise, or finally reckon with the legacy that built its fortunes? And you, the viewer, the reader, the citizen, what is your role? Because this isn't just a story about Burkina Faso, it's about who gets to decide the value of a nation's future. It's about whether resources are blessings or burdens, whether sovereignty is honored or punished, whether justice is an ideal or an inconvenience. You've seen the images, heard the chants, felt the urgency. Now ask yourself, if gold can be frozen with a phone call, what else can be taken with silence? If sovereignty can be punished, what happens when we stop defending it? And if a nation dares to rise, will we stand with it? Or simply watch from the sidelines, waiting to see who wins? History doesn't just happen. It is written by the choices we make today. So save this story. Share it. Debate it. Remember it. Because whether you live in the Sahel, New York, Nairobi, or New Delhi, the future of freedom is being tested here. And if Africa proves that sovereignty is possible, it won't just rewrite its own story. It will rewrite the rules for us all.